My name is Tobias Kremer. I'm a junior research fellow in the Religion Frontier Challenges program at Pembroke College, Oxford. And together with Marietta, I am welcoming you this evening in the name of the Alfred Landecker Programme, one of the Blavatnik School's research programs on the rights of minorities and other vulnerable people. And just a very brief note before we dive in, that today's seminar is actually part of a series of seminars on populism, religion, and democracy put up by the Landecker Programme. And for your calendars, the next two ones will be first on the 18th of May on gaps in the protection of religious minorities through international law, and then on the 1st of June on securitization and the protection of minorities. So we hope to see many or most or all of you there, ideally. But of course, today's seminar is on race, religion, and war in the making of America, and I'm delighted to welcome Phil Gorski from Yale University and Jeffrey Haynes from London Metropolitan University. It's fantastic to have both of you here. And I'm not going to try to put to do justice in terms of introductions. I think that that would probably go beyond the time we have. But very briefly, Phil is a professor in sociology and religious studies at Yale, where his research focuses on religion and politics in early modern and modern Europe and North America. His recent books include American Covenant, a history of civil religion from Puritans to the present, and American Babylon, Christianity, Democracy Before and After Trump. And Phil has been a great friend and colleague, both for the Landecker Programme and as well as for the Protestant Political Thought Project over many years. And he was also the examiner of my PhD thesis. So I can very much personally vouch for his academic rigor, but also of him being a fantastic conversation partner about these issues. And today, Phil will start the conversation by giving us a bit of an insight into some of his research on white Christian nationalism, one of the oldest and deepest currents in American political life, which very much erupted back into full view under the presidency of Donald Trump, and in particular in the debate surrounding the Capitol riots on January 6th. And Phil very much locates this, the wellsprings of this in the violent racial conflicts of the late 17th century and sketches its development to the present day. And then we'll conclude by comparing contemporary white Christian nationalism with its historical antecedents and reflect on its relationship with right-wing populism. And then Phil's presentation will be followed by a response of our second interlocutor, Jeff Haynes. Jeff is an emeritus professor of politics at London Metropolitan University. He is the author and editor of numerous volumes on the topic and journals. And we're absolutely delighted to have him here and to cooperate with him. We are particularly delighted because in the context of our cooperation, we have now also a forthcoming special issue with a journal that Jeff is the editor of, International Journal of Religion, and a special issue will be on nationalism, populism, and the struggle for Christian heritage and identity. And Jeff will provide today a response based on his brand new book that just hit the shelves on Trump and the politics of neo-nationalism, the Christian right and secular right in America, in which Jeff analyzes the political impact of both America's Christian right, as well as America's new secular nationalist right in relation to America's culture wars at home, and then also the clash of civilizations in US foreign policy. And as you can imagine, we will have loads and loads to talk about with these issues. So I don't want to keep you any longer. Just a very quick word on housekeeping. As we already go through the presentations, do feel free to start formulating questions in the chat. And then I'll try to call on people. We most likely will have to make a bit of a selection or bind questions together in order to get you out on time if you're in the UK to enjoy your newly won freedom of having a pint in the pub, and we definitely won't stop you from that. So yes, without further ado, Phil, floor is yours.
Okay, well, Marietta, Tobias, thank you very much for the invitation, and thanks to everyone else for joining the seminar. So I'm currently finishing up a book with a co-author, Sam Perry of the University of Oklahoma, and the tentative title is Flag and Cross, White Christian Nationalism and the Threat to American Democracy. And we're currently in the process of revising it. So this is a very welcome opportunity to give a brief overview of the book and its core arguments, and get some sort of feedback about what's clear, what's not, what should be in there that's not, and so on and so forth. The way that we organize the book is in terms of a series of interrogatives. So what, when, how, and where. So what is it? When did it first emerge? How does it work in contemporary politics? And where precisely is it headed? And we do this, we answer these questions by combining quantitative and qualitative evidence, survey evidence, and historical narrative, which we think enrich and inform one another. So let me just begin very quickly with the what question. What exactly is white Christian nationalism? Well, one way of understanding it is as a set of policy preferences about the role of religion, and in particular of Christianity in American public life, and various other policy issues, including economics, foreign affairs, social policy, and so on and so forth, things that one can address with survey evidence. Another way of understanding it is as a frame or a narrative, or what my fellow sociologist Arlie Hochschild has called a deep story, which is a sort of half-articulate script or narrative that people use for interpreting political reality and imagining a political future. So let me then just say a little bit more about what I mean by this idea of the deep story. So the sort of simple version of it is that America was founded as a Christian nation by white Christians who were Orthodox Christians, that the founding documents, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, are built on Christian foundations, or perhaps even divinely inspired, that America is an exceptional or even chosen nation, which has been blessed with exceptional prosperity and power, but that prosperity and that power is always and eternally threatened by the presence of non-whites, non-Christians, non-Americans on American soil, which risks divine wrath and the withdrawal of divine blessings. So in the first chapter, we simply try to show that white Christian nationalism actually exists. There have been many prominent conservative Christian leaders in the United States who have rejected it as a slur, or have argued that it's poorly defined, but we use a well-validated scale that allows us to measure various degrees of Christian nationalism, and also to identify its social locations and the various kinds of policy preferences that it's associated with. And let me just give you just a very sort of brief executive summary of the findings. Part of what we find is quite unsurprising, which is that white Christian nationalists want Christianity to have a more prominent role in American public life. Other things which are seen from this perspective perhaps somewhat more surprising, though also familiar. There's a strong association with a kind of libertarian free market capitalism. There's strong nativist, xenophobic, anti-Black racist strand. There is also an opposition on the one hand to gun laws, but a belief in the necessity of a strong military and a law and order criminal justice system on the other. So in some ways, none of this is terribly unexpected. What I've really just described to you in some ways is just the Republican political platform. So let me just quickly turn to the who aspect of this. So oftentimes white Christian nationalism is used as a kind of a synonym for the religious right, the Christian right, the moral majority, social conservatism. This is not quite right. So while white Christian nationalism is overrepresented amongst white evangelicals, it's by no means monopolized by them. So there are many mainline white Christians who are white Christian nationalists. A good number of conservative white Catholics are as well. And it's important to emphasize that there are also a fair number of white evangelicals and significant numbers of mainline Protestants and Catholics who are not white Christian nationalists. And interestingly, many of the things that have been associated with white evangelicalism, such as nativist beliefs or racist beliefs, disappear once we control for white Christian nationalism. So this sort of sets up the problem of the second chapter, which is how did these things come to be associated with one another? How did this particular package of beliefs and preferences get tied up with one another? And when exactly did this package first get assembled? So the kind of punchline of this chapter is that the answer is much, much earlier than people thought. So many people think, well, white Christian nationalism is something that emerged maybe in the 1980s, or perhaps it emerged in the 1950s, or some might even push it back to the 1930s. But the argument of the second chapter in the book is that it actually is already there in full-blown form by the 1690s. And to explain why and how we come up with this date, I have to say a little bit more about the contents of this deep story of Christian nationalism, in particular, the various threads of biblical narrative that get interpreted and tied together to make this package. So the deep story of white Christian nationalism is actually not really one story originally, but three different stories that are all taken from different parts of Christian scripture. The first is what I call the promised land story. And this is the notion that the New World, New England, is a promised land, that the Puritans, the English colonists, are a chosen people, a new Israel, that the native peoples are in fact like the Amalekites or the Canaanites, and that it is a God-given right of white English settlers to take their land away from the native peoples who are occupying it, and to turn it into their promised land. So that's the first piece. The second piece is the end time story, and this is a particular understanding of biblical prophecy, especially the book of Revelation, which interprets the text in a highly literalistic and highly supernaturalistic fashion as an actual prediction or forecast of future events. And this is a story which, if you have ever studied American religion, you'll probably know that the book of Revelation contains kind of coded forecasts of future events, that there will be a kind of a final showdown between the forces of good and evil that will involve natural and supernatural forces, and that once that Christ will return to earth to conclude the battle and initiate his millennial reign on earth. And this is an interpretation which for most of Western Christian history was quite heretical. Its roots in New England actually go back to the English Civil War and the various millenarian interpretations thereof, and is exported from England to New England. The third piece is what I call the racial curse complex, and this is an interpretation of the Great Flood story. Noah has three sons. One of the sons, Ham, is cursed for seeing his father naked and intoxicated. A mark is placed on him, and all of his progeny are destined to become servants of others. And this is used, as many of you may know, as a sort of a template for understanding racial difference as Europeans during the early modern period discovered, and it becomes, particularly within the context of the New World, an explanation for Black slavery, for the enslavement of kidnapped Africans in the New World. But the 1690s, these three different scriptural threads have been woven together into a single story. And so once we sort of have this frame in place, this story in place, it becomes the lens through which many conservative white Christians throughout American history interpret their place in the New World and their relationship to other peoples in the New World. Over time, the Native Americans are replaced by other antagonists, by Mexicans in the Southwest, by Chinese immigrants on the West Coast, by Irish Catholic and Italian Catholic immigrants, by Jewish immigrants, by Muslims today, secularists, humanists, and so on and so forth. But while they're sort of continuing rejigging and recasting, the fundamental script, the fundamental deep story remains more or less unaltered. In the third chapter, we introduce another aspect of the deep story, which is what we call white Christian individualism. Because the protagonist in these stories, although the antagonist changes, the protagonist is almost always a white Christian man. And the role that the white Christian man plays is to defend his freedom by exercising violence in order to sustain the racial and social order. And there are different sort of paradigmatic figures who've been cast in this role. The cowboy is one of the most recent and most obvious, or the special ops soldier, perhaps more contemporaneously. If one goes further back in history, one could look at the figure of the frontier scout or the Indian scout or the Indian fighter as a sort of a prototype of the white Christian individualist. And so what's really crucial here is the way, again, in which themes of white freedom, righteous violence, and racial order are tied together, and with the white Christian hero cast as the one who's the protector of all those things. And so in this last chapter, we show how white Christian nationalism, white Christian individualism work in tandem. I mean, the way I put it is that you really have to see them as two sides of the same coin. And that when you flip that coin, it's a heads I win, tails you lose, or rather heads whites win, tails blacks lose sort of situation. What I mean by this is that when white Christians make claims on their fellow citizens, they do so in the name of the nation, of solidarity, of tradition, of order. And when non-whites make demands on their fellow citizens, those demands are rejected because they threaten order, because they threaten violence, because they infringe on white freedom. We then sort of show how this works through a series of contemporary events over the last 20 years. And I'll just mention these very briefly: the Tea Party, the MAGA movement, and then most recently, the Black Lives Matter movement and the Capitol insurrection. The Tea Party movement presents itself as a libertarian, secular movement, but we show that it was primarily carried by conservative white Christians, and that it was infused from the very beginning with white Christian nationalist themes. In the MAGA movement, we see the exact reverse. It frames itself as a white Christian nationalist movement, make America great again, meaning make America Christian and white again. And yet it's infused with libertarian themes, opposition to cancel culture, opposition to political correctness, and so on and so forth. And we see this finally in the very divergent reactions of conservative white Christians to the Black Lives Matter movement and to the Capitol insurrection. So the Black Lives Matter movement is portrayed as a threat to property, as a threat to order, as a threat to freedom, whereas the Capitol insurrection movement is portrayed as righteous violence in the name of freedom, tacitly against racial others and foreign invaders. Finally, in the conclusion, we briefly take on the where question, by which we mean, where is white Christian nationalism headed? And there we briefly identify four different scenarios. So the first and most frightening is what I would call Cristofascism. And I don't use this term, I use this term advisedly, not just in the sense that one sees fascistoid tendencies in some of these groups, but that there are some of the increasingly actually adopting the fascist label and aligning with groups which understand themselves as fascist. Happy to say more about this. Another tendency that we see is in fact a tendency towards secularization in the traditional sense, which is that there are increasing numbers of younger white evangelical Christians who are simply leaving the fold altogether because of this unbreakable association between religious conservatism and political conservatism. And because they can't brook the political conservatism, they leave their religion behind. The third tendency is fragmentation. And this is along lines of race, religion, and gender, or race, generation, and gender. I'll just mention race and gender. High profile case this past month, Beth Moore, very influential female evangelical leader, and this has left the Southern Baptist Convention because of can't brook the patriarchalism anymore. Similarly, many Black evangelicals who are part of white evangelical churches are engaged in what they call a leave loud movement, which means to leave those multiracial spaces, which they have come to find as inhospitable for Black evangelical Christians. So fragmentation. And then I think that what you may be seeing, and this is in a way the sort of the hopeful, the more hopeful scenario, is an actual reckoning that's going on within even white evangelical circles itself. In fact, just this morning, Russell Moore, who's one of the most important theological leaders of the Southern Baptist Convention, released a really strong statement founded in quite conservative biblical interpretation and historical reading, arguing that systemic and racial injustice are not at all at odds with a conservative theological understanding, but absolutely core to it. And so this might provide the possibility of a real popular front in defense of liberal democracy that would unite some kind of theologically conservative, but politically liberal conservative Christians. So that's a lot, but I did want to give a sort of a sense of the full sweep of the argument, and that's it.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Phil. What I'd like to do is kind of respond to that, and I have to confess that Phil sent me and Marietta the 3 chapters the other day. I've had a look through them, but I haven't had a chance to really deeply delve into them and read them very carefully. But I've certainly got a good sense of where he's coming from, where him and Sam Perry are coming from in this. And then I want to just spend a little bit of time on my own treatment of these issues. And it's by background, I'm an international relations scholar, and I've also looked into political science issues. So I'm not a sociologist. So to some extent, there'll be a different focus on this. Although, to be fair, my conclusions will be very similar, I think, to Philip's. Okay, so Phil tells us about begins by saying that white Christian nationalism is a threat to democracy in America, and then wants to say about what it is, how did it emerge, and where is it heading. And I think he's right to suggest it's a set of policy preferences in terms of economics, foreign affairs, social policy. It's also a framing or a narrative. And it builds historically, I think is fair to say, on a perception of America as a chosen nation, God's chosen people, who have a place on earth which is to guide others in how to behave in a civilizational sense, rooted in Protestant Christianity, originally from Europe. And of course, as Philip explains, over time, the racial makeup and the religious makeup and the makeup of US socially and sociologically has changed dramatically. So we've seen a movement, if you like, from a particular kind of nation to a much more diverse nation, which has happened very much over the last 2 or 3 decades. So I think one thing to notice about this is to say that there's changing national and international context, which enables white Christian nationalism to have a particularly strong and profound and potentially continuing political impact in the United States. In parentheses, I'd also want to suggest, if I have time, that there's more to it than simply the US being enmeshed in this stuff. This is in many ways a global phenomenon. So it goes back a long way, as Philip mentioned, right back to the 17th century, perhaps. But I would say that really to see this as a political phenomenon of the kind that we've seen during the Trump era, we need to look at the more recent past. The background is certainly there, though. Very interesting notion of white Christian individualism, which is usually male, where the person defends their freedom, if necessary, by exercising righteous violence as a wish to maintain the existing order. And I don't think Philip mentioned, but maybe the storming of the Capitol on January the 6th is a manifestation of that. Certainly could be seen in that context. And Philip talks about how white Christian individualism and white Christian nationalism work together. And he mentioned the Tea Party in this context. Of course, when the Tea Party emerged, it wasn't regarded necessarily as a white Christian movement, but it was certainly regarded as a kind of conservative movement, which managed to infiltrate the Republican Party significantly, perhaps. And if you like, to energize the Republican Party with Tea Party concerns. It was projected as a libertarian secular movement, but even back then, certainly with hindsight, we can see the Tea Party as increasingly linked to some of the issues that the Christian right or the Christian or white Christian nationalists have also been energized by. So I think there's a coming together. We might say heuristically, it's a combination of secular and religious ideas which coalesced in the Tea Party. Where's it headed? Well, I think it's very useful to sketch out potential scenarios. Cristofascism, a tendency towards secularization, fragmentation of the country along racial, religious, and gender lines, or the evangelical circles themselves work to fight back against a white Christian perspective with all its exclusivity and involving certain approaches to other racial groups in the US who fall outside that particular frame. So I think from a sociological perspective, that's a really extremely attractive overview of what's happened. If I could just shift from that to a very brief focus on my own take on this. First of all, I don't see this as a uniquely United States phenomenon. Clearly, white Christian nationalism in the US is linked to American history, culture, religion, and so on. But I think it's part of a much wider phenomenon, which has certainly affected Europe. It certainly affected countries further afield, including Brazil, maybe, including India. and it's something which has emerged rather simultaneously almost, which leads to a second question: why now? Why are we now talking about white Christian nationalism in the US as a political phenomenon of such importance, when, as Philip explained to us, it's been around for a long, long time. It's had intermittent political impact, but it's never had a consistent political impact. And the same could be said of, let's call them ideologies in Europe and elsewhere, which are also at the same time exhibiting similar facets of white Christian nationalism and potentially white Christian individualism. So why now? The third issue leading on from the why now is, why was Trump able to harness this? I mean, we all know that Trump is somebody who wouldn't necessarily be seen as a card-carrying Christian evangelical, somebody who has the attributes of a highly Christian person. I mean, he may be, but that's not how he comes across. So why did Trump manage to harness this? Why did Trump manage so successfully? I mean, it's worth bearing in mind that Trump was the 16th out of 16 Republican candidates when he started. And he came through to not only win the nomination, but also to win the presidency. Now, however we regard Trump, and I'm not a fan, he was somebody who was politically highly successful. And to answer my own question, I would suggest that what Trump was most effective at doing was not just harnessing white Christian nationalism, because almost by definition, that's going to be a minority of Americans. America, like everywhere else in the West, is secularizing. The Christian nature of America is declining, I would suggest. So I don't think it's enough to suggest, not that Philip did, but it's not enough to suggest that you can win the presidency by just latching onto the white Christian nationalist vote. Something else must be going on to enable Trump not only to win in 2016, but also to increase his the number of votes he acquired in 2020 by 5 million. I mean, Trump didn't win, but he still got higher number of votes than in 2016. So his policies were attractive. They were electorally effective. He managed to win the presidency. So I think to see white Christian nationalism as the pivotal aspect of Trump's electoral success is true. But I also think it's true that Trump was able to manifest the attributes and goals that the white Christian nationalists were very keen to see. So in other words, Trump made a pact, if you like, that when elected, he would seek to satisfy the demands of the white Christian nationalists. And he did so. He proceeded to implement policies like, for example, enabling the Supreme Court to be filled with religious conservatives, to the extent that the Supreme Court has, for the first time in many years, been on the side of religious freedom, as the white Christian nationalists might put it. So Trump delivered policies that the white Christian nationalists would support, and they did support him. He was the only guy they would vote for in 2020. There was no chance of Biden getting it for such people, even though Biden was perhaps a more overtly Christian person. I know that's obviously open to debate, but so my take on this really is that Trump was able to harness white Christian nationalism, but align it with something that I'm calling in the book, America First nationalism, whereby the goals of Trump's non-white Christian nationalist supporters very much chime with Trump's antipathy towards globalization, towards what he called America being ripped off by China, by the European Union, by everybody really, that we seem to be thriving while the US seem to be hemorrhaging jobs. And I think that it's fairly clear from the survey data that Trump's support in the Rust Belt states, for example, was enough to win him the election in 2016 over Hillary Clinton. So I think to align the two strands together, if one is trying to explain the political success and electoral success of Trump, one would need to bring in not just the white Christian nationalist constituency, which is large, but not large enough on its own to make the key difference, align it with what I'm calling America First nationalism, which Trump, for all his other qualities, was very, very effective at doing. So my suggestion would be that to get the real handle on white Christian nationalism, we need to think of it in a slightly wider context, perhaps a global context, and also think about how politically and electorally the white Christian right was able to work with. I mean, this is slightly difficult because one isn't either religious or secular. One can be, secular in some respects, religious in other respects. But as a way of trying to explain the Trump phenomenon, I quite like the idea of a coming together, an interaction of overtly Christianized nationalism, right-wing white Christian nationalism, with other aspects of American nationalism, which doesn't depend upon Christianity, its organizing principle.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, both of you. I think that was really, really quite amazing, well-structured, very clear arguments. And we can see we already have quite a lot of questions, which is really great. And I think most of them are really to the point. Before going into each one of those, I will take the privilege of having been made chair, because one thing that I think was really interesting in both of you presentations was to see how white Christian nationalism plays out, how it also relates to secularization and how that comes together. But then also, as Jeff just mentioned, it's interesting how then it was almost unreachable for somebody like Joe Biden to get voters out of that, to shift voting behavior, etc. And that just made me think about one of Phil's books on also not just white Christian nationalism, but also the American civil religious tradition. And I'd just be very interested on both of your views, given that Biden so strongly tried, both in his campaign and in his, for instance, in his inauguration speech, to reenact this idea of the American civil religion as a form of integration, and basically pushing it precisely against the exclusivist parts of white Christian nationalism. And I'd be very intrigued in both of your views to what extent, in a increasingly more secular, more diverse universe in the US, and then on the other hand, the surge of both secular and white Christian nationalism, is there still a place at all for the American civil religion in a positive, inclusive way, or do you think that heyday is past, or maybe has it never really existed, and that is just us social scientists having glorified history in some ways? Whoever wants to start about that, maybe Phil.
I would read Biden's inaugural side by side with Amanda Gorman's performance. I don't know if she's the young African-American woman who did this sort of poetry, slam poetry performance. I'm not sure the proper genre to put it in, but there you can see sort of two different versions, an older, whiter version and a younger, more secular version. And to be honest with you, I think insofar as that tradition has any future, it will be carried not by people like Biden, but by people like Gorman, which is to say African Americans, and in particular African Americans who can speak in both a secular and a religious register. And I'll just give one example of this. She talks about climbing the hill, right? And so that's clearly, on my reading, an allusion to the idea of the city on a hill, right? Which is the central metaphor in many versions of this contemporary civil religious tradition. And so but she's able to do this without sort of explicit theological claims or references, so that it can resonate with both audiences. I mean, I think it's really, in that sense, also up to Amanda Gorman, in the sense that I don't think it's people like me who will determine whether or not it does have a future. It will be people who have a certain kind of lyrical or poetic gift, like Amanda Gorman.
Yes, I think that's a very good point. And I think that the thing about Biden, of course, is that very few, I think, went for him because he was such a inspiring, charismatic figure. But I suppose after Trump, something like normality was quite a welcome attribute of a president. I don't know. I think it's very hard to envisage whether the Biden presidency is simply an interregnum, is simply a step on the way to what Phil's been describing as Cristofascism, or some kind of non-democratic ideology taking over in the US. Personally, I doubt that. But I mean, for example, we haven't mentioned about Black Lives Matter, and we haven't mentioned the corrosive, not even toxic influence that's had upon the body politic in the US. And going to Tobias's question about civil religion, I think it emphasizes that the notion of going back to something like a civil religion continuity is simply out the window. The culture wars have been too entrenched. The racial divisions are too entrenched. The diversity in the US is now too entrenched. But it begs the question, I guess this is what Biden might have been trying to get at when he enabled Amanda Gorman's poetry, was what do we replace that with? Because one thing about the American myth, the founding myth, the cultural myth of America, is that we are all Americans together with shared attributes, shared values, shared visions, and shared hopes. And if you take that away, whether it's based on Christianity or whether you base it on something else, what do you replace it with? And I think it's a much bigger question for all societies right now that are confronted with how we build societies that are comfortable with themselves. And I think the United States is indicating by its recent political history that this is a very difficult issue to resolve. And I would agree that the Biden presidency probably doesn't offer many answers in itself, although it might potentially encompass a vision of the future which could conceivably take the place of a Christianized vision, which seems to me to be not possible to unite people anymore.
Fantastic. I think there's loads to think about, and maybe building on that. I mean, we have loads of different questions going in different directions. And I want to go to Ralph's question in a second about the economic side of that. But given that we are currently looking a bit at the historical evolution and where it's going, maybe we can start with both Jonathan's and Maya's questions in a way that really try to trace that back. So Jonathan, do you want to quickly formulate your question very, very briefly, and then Maya, if you want to add to Jonathan's question, and then we can have Jeff and Phil responding to that.
Okay, so yeah, this was a question for Philip. So I wonder if in the book, whether you trace the trajectory of white Christian nationalism beyond the 17th century, right through, say, to the mid-20th century, where we can more easily begin to see it emerging again in recognizable form. So is there a story that you tell there, and is there real continuity, in other words, between the 17th and 20th centuries, so that we can speak about a recrudescence or a revival, or is it simply a sort of pragmatic, almost weaponized new iteration that simply appeals to those older myths for purely communicative and pragmatic reasons?
I'll answer very quickly, which is the short answer is yes. Though not in the detail that I would like. It's one chapter in what's intended to be a short book for a general reading public. And so I can't, trace the development throughout. Let me just give you one example, which I do treat in a little bit of detail. And this is a version of white Christian nationalism, which I call Wasp Imperialism, which is regnant during the late 19th and early 20th century. And so, WASP, as I'm sure you know, stands for White Anglo-Saxon Protestant, and this is a period in which America understands itself quite explicitly, not just as a nation, but also as an empire. And this is different from the earlier version in a number of different senses. First of all, there is also an internal hierarchy within whiteness, which is contained in the term White Anglo-Saxon Protestant, which is counterposed in the South to white trash, which is counterposed in the North to, Italians, Irish, Catholics, Jews. So an internal hierarchy within whiteness. It also has a different eschatology, technical term being post-millennial. And this is the idea that that it's America's destiny to actually create the kingdom of God on earth through its civilizing mission, through its missionary activities, and of course also through its military. And this is also different from the present day instantiation in the sense that the real center of it is in the Northeast, and the carriers of it are the liberal Protestant establishment. So this is, more Teddy Roosevelt than it is Franklin Delano Roosevelt, for example. But my view, and this goes back a little bit to some of the questions that Jeffrey raised, is that this is a phenomenon that's present continuously in American politics, and that it is hottest and most ferocious in periods of demographic change and racialized conflict. And this is one reason why we see it rearing its head so fiercely today, is that the rapid demographic changes within the US, the to many terrifying prospect of a non-white majority within 20 or 30 years in the United States, and the sort of reimagining of America's internal and external enemies as racial others, as opposed to ideological others, as they were primarily during the Cold War. So I do think it's a relatively continuous history, but I can't show that in such a short chapter with the detail that I would like. I mean, I'm thinking I might really need to write a longer monograph that's just really, a more detailed history of these different phases in its development.
Maya, do you want to quickly say whether you want to build on that question? And maybe, Mark, I saw that your questions 1 and 2 might also be in relation to this historical development. So if either for Phil or Jeff, you have something to add to this, please do. Maya and then Marka.
Thank you. Phil, thanks so much for a really great overview of what sounds like a fascinating book. I guess my question does pick up on these historical moments of change. I mean, I'm thinking a little bit about Roger Smith's work on kind of the dual national narratives that have always existed, right? So there's always been this racialized, and I think you talk about religiously infused national narrative that's coexisted with a civic one that Tobias also talked about in his question. And I guess, I'm a political scientist. And so I think about these moments of change that we've seen in terms of progressive policies actually being implemented, the Civil Rights Act and so forth in the United States. And, they have often used the language of universalism, the language of kind of that civic nationalism. And so, in answer to that question, the earlier question, you said, well, it's going to be the Amanda Gormans of the world that carry this vision, but it also has to be done in a way that kind of invokes that civic language. And so I guess the question is really about looking back at these key moments where you've seen a loosening of this kind of white Anglo-Saxon Christian nationalism. To me, again, looking elsewhere, I work on India, where certainly there's a changing national identity. And I think the moments of change have to do with organization, and it has to do with the invocation of an inclusive civic narrative. So I'd just love to hear your reflections on that.
Marco, do you want to quickly add your question, and then we can have answer both questions?
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much. So originally, my background is in American studies, right? So quite a few of your arguments and your themes are going to very much resonate with the ways in which I was trained. And then at the same time, I'm thinking also because, you presented it as something you're working on and you're wanting feedback. So I was also thinking, so that's where the question is coming from. Where do you get resistance from me? And so it also has to do with that historical, and I think in two ways. So on the one hand, that if you have an audience, some people who are readers who are coming from that historical background, but that I'm sure you're really aware of, right? You're going to get resistant because for historians, context is everything, and so to have sort of this kind of sweeping statement like by 1690, it's consolidated. Full blown, even though we know that, say something like nationalism itself really still has to consolidate, and what whiteness means and Christianity and all of that, right? Transform. So it seems as if there's kind of a fundamental logic, and then you can just sort of plug in the ingredients regardless of what historical moment it is. And the reason where I'm hesitating is, does that mean that, for example, that when we get to the present moment, two aspects. One is, would you go so far as to say that the speaker, the carrier of white Christian nationalism doesn't even have to be white, right? So somebody like Ted Cruz, right? Would you put him in that white nationalist thing? And how far would you go, right? Would you put a black speaker, and what then is white Christian nationalism? And then from a very different kind of angle, to me, that kind of continuity resonates with arguments made by somebody like Isabel Wilkerson, right, about caste, race as caste, and sort of these deep structures. But there's a kind of fundamental pessimism in that, because then it seems as if this will never, ever be something that we can, that we can eliminate, that we can overcome, that we can really essentially do. It's a cancer within our body, and somehow we have to see how to tamp it down generation by generation. But in fact, it is ineradicable from 1690 to now and for the next 400 years. Is that really what you're arguing?
Great. So I guess these questions are, in a deep sense, interlinked, because in a way, what you're asking is, is the story that we're telling too fatalistic, too pessimistic? In the 2017 book where I started thinking about this American Covenant, there really the central subject is this civil religious tradition, which you can think of as a religious version or a religious angle on what Rogers calls civic nationalism, right? In which that the shorthand that I use for it is prophetic republicanism. Prophetic, obviously, with a PH and not with an F. And this is a sort of a fusion of Republican political philosophy, as many during the Revolutionary War would have understood it, with a different appropriation of the Pentateuch, in which covenant and law are really and inclusiveness are really sort of crucial to the understanding, which rejects this kind of, understanding of prophecy as forecasting of future events. And so that is also a tradition which you can see play out at various points in American history: the Revolution, abolitionism, the Civil War, Reconstruction, the New Deal, World War II, the Civil Rights Movement, right? So, in a certain way, what I'm doing is just telling a story a lot like what Rogers tells, but with greater attention to religion, and now with greater attention to the way that that religion interacts with and sometimes stands in for race in American discourse. And I suppose, if I were telling the story a little bit differently in a somewhat different context, it would be more a story about 2 steps forward, 1 step back. In each of the major periods that I look at in this book and in the others, there are, in fact, these moments of possibility and fluidity. I think we're in one of those moments right now, and there always are people who are using the kind of universalistic, inclusive language. And so, one of my favorite examples, Matt Rowley will like this, is Roger Williams, who is incredibly conservative theologically, but his political, in terms of his, well, let me put it this way, he has incredibly conservative soteriology, but he has an incredibly liberal ecclesiology and political theology, right? Which allows him easily to envision a pluralistic coexistence with people amidst very deep difference and political solidarity around collective self-governance. And I think that's a sort of a recurring counter narrative and counter trope to white Christian nationalism throughout history. And in a certain sense, that's what Biden is doing at this very moment, is playing more on the sort of the common good themes, banal as they are, the pandemic, the infrastructure, and so on, in hopes of bringing people together across these very, 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 very deep divides. So I hope that addresses some of the questions.
Could I add something?
Yes,
quite a few of the questions have been asking about the nature of white Christian nationalism, whether white is a good descriptor, because of course Trump's vote went up amongst Latino men in particular, went up marginally amongst the Black community. It wasn't just within the white constituency where he was at the end appeal. I think it's a very useful descriptor though for a sort of a cultural approach to the world, which we can sort of use the shorthand term white, but it exemplifies something a bit wider than simply skin color. It exemplifies a cultural worldview in which people of various races and indeed religions wish to cleave to a certain approach to the world, a certain set of values, which we can call white, but it goes beyond that, I think. And it also begs the question about how much this is simply a US phenomenon. Okay, it draws on a long history, particular American history, but it's well known that the Trump brand of Trump ideology, if I can call it that, had its supporters elsewhere. Trump was able to build an international power base amongst like-minded leaders and politicians. And they tended to talk about the same sort of stuff and tended to use the same kind of arguments to try to win their support. So I think one of the major differences between now and the past is that where politics and when politics was more nationalized in the sense that it took place within the nation, and what took place outside was relatively unimportant. The context now is so different to that. And I mean, in a banal way, we see that with the COVID phenomenon. It's a global phenomenon, literally. But ideas now can be of global significance so easily. And I think that the way that Trump was able to pursue a set of ideas, which we can, of course, call white Christian nationalism, but we could also call it in other contexts, let's call it Hindu nationalism. Let's call it Brazilian Christian nationalism. This is a set of ideological suppositions and beliefs about the world, which unites people across international boundaries. So I think if we're talking about what follows, it might even be worth thinking about a fifth category to add to Philip's four, which is that this becomes an international phenomenon. which enables the kind of views that we could probably itemize in a number of bullet points to be of global persistence. And of course, one of the key ones is an anti-immigration, anti-racial minority approach that the white Christian nationalists, wherever they are, exemplify. And we've certainly seen this in Europe to a considerable degree, that white populist nationalist politicians have benefited hugely in unexpected places like the Netherlands, like Sweden, like Italy, the last places you would expect to be places of white Christian nationalist ideological appeal. So I think when thinking about this in the US context, it potentially is of value to think of it in a wider context and see how the ideas of white Christian nationalism transcends national boundaries and transcends skin color to become an ideological phenomenon which can unite people irrespective of skin color, race, ethnicity, and so on.
And that's actually a perfect transition. I guess you also already answered a couple of the questions that we have here from John Ildo and Jonathan Wolfe and Matt Rowley about the role of Zionism, the Judeo part of Judeo-Christian values, or the racial diversity in some ways that you find during the riots. But Jonathan, Matt, John Ildo, do you want to dig in on any of these questions or add to that?
May I just raise a question about the concept of Cristofascism that's been mentioned by Phil, and it's been used somewhere else. I mean, I am in Brazil right now, and a friend of mine has just published a book called Cristofascism, and he's trying to address the questions of the rise of this evangelical right-wing politics in Brazil, which is coupled with the rise of Bolsonaro as a leader. But I think the notion, when you consider these double aspects of the element of Zionism connected to this discourse and this multiracial, so to speak, expression of these ideas and repertoires of action and everything, doesn't that stretch too far the concept of fascism in this Christo-fascism qualification? Okay,
so a lot of very good, very thought-provoking questions there from Jeff and Juanito. So I completely agree with you about the internationalism of the phenomenon, about the need to think about it and analyze it comparatively, if for no other reason, just because there are organizational and intellectual networks connecting these people, because they're watching one another, learning from one another actively, borrowing from each other in various ways. So absolutely no argument with you there. Maybe one way of sort of approaching some of the questions that have come up is just to say a little bit more about white Christian nationalism and its Trumpian version, and then white Christian individualism, as I understand it. So one way of understanding Trumpism, I often say, is as a secularized and reactionary version of white Christian nationalism. This is something that differentiates it from the kind of euphemistic but still vaguely Christian version of American exceptionalism that you would have heard from George W. Bush or Ronald Reagan, with occasional scriptural references, also with the background understanding, especially in George W. Bush's case, that he was a church-going evangelical. So remember, I talked about these different themes that are sort of interwoven in white Christian nationalism. And I think what you find is sort of secular versions of those in Trump's rhetoric. And so there's a lot of talk about blood and violence. He understands politics in a kind of a Schmittian way as, friend and foe, that it's about loyalty and order, as opposed to collective self-governance and debate. I could say more, but I think just to say in a very shorthand term, the way that he talks about America is a way that resonates with both a secular white nationalist audience and with a white Christian nationalist audience. And that is, of course, one of his great accomplishments, is to have figured out a way of talking, of telling the deep story that resonates with both of those audiences. So in that sense, I think we agree about the importance of that coalition between secular white nationalists and white Christian nationalists. And I think it's actually that coalition, this anticipating a little bit my answer to Juanita's question, that explains why some white Christian nationalists are being pulled in increasingly Cristofascist directions by their interaction with real card-carrying neo-Nazis and white nationalists. And the mainstreaming and platforming of those themes. An example that some of you may or may not have caught is Tucker Carlson, Fox News host, the most watched news host in the United States, spent most of last week kind of shilling for great replacement theory in the most explicit possible terms. It was amazing. So this is where you can start to see this merger between white Christian nationalism and secular white nationalism. Let me say a little bit about white Christian individualism and how I think that helps us to understand how and why it is that that this view can also appeal to people who are not currently coded as white. In part because of the connection between being white, being Christian, and being an individualist. By being enough of a Christian or an individualist, you can become an honorary white person, right? And you can also become a token of anti-racist individualism within the MAGA movement. And in the sense, it's no accident that during the Republican National Convention, yes, I watched the whole damn thing, there were probably more Black Republicans than in many who spoke than there are Black Republicans in several states in the Union. And I'm really not exaggerating. It was incredible how many of them they trotted out. But I think this also speaks to a question that you were raising, which is that there is a kind of a coherent ethos, what I call, what many people call an ethos of personal accountability. And this is, the idea that the world is composed of completely autonomous, rational individuals who exist completely outside of any social or historical context, and whose fate is completely in their own hands and is completely the result of their own choices. And what this ethos does is it connects an Armenian soteriology, of voluntary conversion, with a libertarian economics. And this is most interesting, with an aggressive foreign policy. The reason it connects with an aggressive foreign policy is because you imagine the nation as the white Christian man writ large, who must also exercise violence, be unconstrained, maintain racial order by policing its own body and preventing its body from being violated by non-white others. So I think white Christian individualism is really sort of the key to understanding this. And of course, you have to, the racial order right now is fluid in many ways. What are, Hispanics and Latinos going to be? Are they going to be Black? Are they going to be white? Are they going to be brown? Ask Latinos and Hispanics in this country, and they're going to give you very different answers to those questions. Ask somebody in the Rio Grande Valley or in South Florida, they're probably going to tell you that they're white, definitely in the Rio Grande Valley. Ask somebody in, East LA or, certain parts of Chicago, and they'll definitely tell you they're Hispanic or Latino. This is an open question, how they will classify themselves and be classified. And that's part of what's at stake with this idea of white Christian individuals, and whether those people will be made full-fledged whites as opposed to honorary whites in the future.
Fantastic. I see we have loads and loads of questions, and we are slowly running out of time. So I definitely want to bring in still Ralph, Sam, Paul, and Marietta, who all have questions, who I don't think had a chance to contribute yet. So shall we just go then quickly for these things chronologically and just have groupings of 2 questions, and then Jeff and Phil, if you can try to keep the answers as quick as possible so we can address all of them. So let's start with Ralph very briefly, and then I think Paul would be the next one. So if the 2 of you, Sam would be the next one. So Ralph and then Sam.
Phil, you've got my question in the chat, but I'll just repeat it. Pro-capitalist. Trump is not, or was not, fully pro-capitalist in my view. He was an economic nationalist, constantly hounding his enemies, as Jeffrey also said. And even domestically, John Judas has written about the producerist ethos, and the coded language there is definitely white Christian nationalist. Whites deserve more welfare state. Others, coded African Americans, don't. Kathy Kramer has shown this. So I would say he's, this movement that you're talking about, at least the current incarnation, is not pro-capitalist in the kind of libertarian free market sense. Would you agree?
It's a great question. I was thinking about it when it popped up in the chat, and so I think if you ask these folks if they were pro-capitalist, they would definitely say yes. In fact, many of them would even say, "I am a capitalist," even though they are, in Marxist terms, working class or wage earners or whatever. And so I think what your question does is it forces us to think, well, what do they mean when they say, "I am a capitalist"? And I think you're right that what they have in mind is, again, a kind of a racially coded libertarianism, which is to say, people, i.e. white people like me, should, who work hard, should be rewarded. What I see is other people, i.e. non-white people, who, because they're non-white, can't possibly be working hard, who are getting more than they deserve. And so, you're quite right to say that in a way we need to put quotation marks or scare quotes around capitalist and pro-market. I think that if you pushed a little deeper and asked them in a long-form interview, well, what do you mean by capitalist? They would say the way that they envision capitalism really is as a bunch of individuals, working hard and competing on an even playing field with one another. And so this does naturally lead them, rightly so, in my view, to distrust and resent, the incredible power of large-scale firms and also of sort of globe-trotting cosmopolitan elites who, in their view, aren't producing anything, right? So I think that's a very helpful clarification.
Quickly, Sam, Paul, Marietta, one after the other, and then we're going to Jeff and then Phil in response to that. Sam.
Okay, well, thank you all, and Phil and Jeff especially. And actually, I think Phil already handled my question to an extent, because I was curious about the narrative that had evolved over the course of American history on the people, as it were. And you demonstrated, of course, that you were attending to people like Roger Williams and other differentiation between the colonies as the nation was in the process of being built. And it seems to me that, the construction of the nation went alongside a narrative of this covenant and exceptionalism, which wasn't necessarily inherent in the ethnocultural and ecclesiological differences that came into the colonies originally. And so that was what I was curious about, but I think you've addressed that. Thank you. And I'm also thankful for the insight into this white Christian individualism, because I think it is quite a concerning and spectacular phenomenon. I mean, just, you know, the idea that you can actually succeed in privatizing salvation is quite disturbing. But it seems to connect in a sense, you could argue that it's the capitalization of Christianity that has succeeded in some political circles in the United States.
Thank you. Thanks, Phil and Jeff. So my question, I think Jeff was pushing in the direction of what is sometimes described as the sort of bad exceptionalism view of America, where America's failings are also sort of exceptional, and pushing against that, saying, well, actually, there's lots of countries today that have some of these white Christian nationalist tendencies. So my question for you, Phil, was, you know, how deep are these deep stories, and how sort of surface level are some of the tropes that come out of them? You mentioned the Amanda Gorman speech where she refers to climbing the hill and, you know, the city on a mountain top, right? We know that from sort of New England, but that's pretty surface area. So are there sort of surface level things that maybe are specific to US history that politicians or, you know, non-politician populists can pick up and sort of say that resonates, that are specific to the US, but some of these deeper stories that you were describing, actually, there's nothing particularly specific to the US about them, and it's better to look at the international connections. That's the sort of heart of the question.
Thank you very much, both Phil and Jeff. I think the question I would like to ask is really about, on the one hand, differentiation that I think Jonathan Chaplin also brings up within white stories or in white communities, in Christian communities. But also, on the other hand, I think the issue that when we see violence, that actually there isn't a unequivocal rejection or denouncing of this violence by white Christian communities on the whole. And we see this in America, but I think we see this to some extent in Europe as well. I wonder if Jonathan would have some thoughts about that as well. But I wonder how you see the role of this kind of hesitation to speak out against violence by some, say, more moderate Christian voices. Last thought, something that was often asked from Muslims when there was terrorism, like it was the expectation that moderate Muslims would of course speak out against that, and there was a lot of disappointment when that didn't happen in the same way that maybe some people had expected. Just wondering on what your thoughts would be on that.
Yeah, I mean, going back to the Ralph's question about economic nationalism, I don't see why the two are necessarily at odds with each other. I mean, I don't think Trump gave any indication that he wasn't a staunch capitalist and a staunch economic nationalist. In the sense, America First meant precisely that American capitalists should prosper and foreign capitalists shouldn't. So, but I mean, that's perhaps not too important from my point of view. Trump was very keen to pal up to billionaires and get money off them. Presumably they're all capitalists, but anyway, but that's, yeah, an interesting issue. White Christian individualism. I don't think it's a uniquely American phenomenon at all. I think it's something which is certainly affecting the countries in Western and Eastern Europe, Western and Central Europe particularly, in the sense that these are people feel under threat from forces beyond their control. I think it's the key thing. And they only have themselves and their families ultimately to rely upon. The state lets them down. The state is probably taken over by elites who don't care very much about them. So I think the individualism thing is given a kind of a racial and a religious connotation, which is probably useful for our purposes. But if we look to other communities, they also are relying upon their individualism to thrive in a world in which they no longer can necessarily thrive through their own efforts, because there are forces beyond their control, and of course those of their governments, that can thwart them doing that. So I think it's a time of great sensitivity and uncertainty about where we go, how we get there, and what the future will be like for our families, which we can certainly see in the white Christian individualism in the US. But I don't think it's a phenomenon which we can only ascribe to white Christian males predominantly. Paul mentioned about what might be referred to as the bad exceptionalism of the US. Well, I think if we do take the international dimension of this to heart, and I personally think we should, then it's politics is always local, to coin the cliche. I mean, politicians always strive by emphasizing the local or national characteristics of their messages. You don't win an election by saying, let's send more foreign aid to Somalia. And people say, yeah, let's vote for them. I mean, that could be part and parcel of their worldview, but it wouldn't win them votes. So I think that it's always about localism, in the extent that in this topic and context, if we want to explain the appeal of politicians like Trump, it's very much an American story about American exceptionally hard done by people who are white Christian nationalists, by the way. But the same message could be amplified if you look at the Netherlands or France or Sweden or almost anywhere really where these kind of notions have caught on in a big way electorally. And finally, Marietta's comment about the hesitation to speak out against violence. Well, one of the things about this January the 6th episode was that in the immediate aftermath, I'm not sure about since then, many Americans, never mind white Christian nationalists, regarded it as something which the left had done, the Antifa people had done, in a kind of a false flag operation. And even though there's loads of evidence, people going through the courts now are to the Proud Boys and so on, they don't know. Well, it's lying media, isn't it? It's, our boys wouldn't do that. They would not storm one of the citadels of American democracy because they're not like that. Well, whatever. Yeah, and I think it's an interesting point about the evangelical leaders, the people who are around Trump, haven't come out en masse and said, we decry the violence on January the 6th. They've either kept quiet, or they said sotto voce, it was probably the left anyway, or they, in one or two cases, have said, yeah, it was unacceptable, but there's been nothing like a uniform response decrying the violence in and of itself.
Phil, do you want to come in on that as well?
I'll just try to say a couple of brief things that will hopefully address a number of the questions that have been raised. So I sometimes say that secular nationalism has a religious unconscious that can always be activated and come to consciousness. And the reason that I say this is because I think the two most important tropes that underlie Western nationalisms both have scriptural roots. So one is this chosen people narrative, which links land, people, and polity, also emancipation or liberation into a coherent narrative. And this is a narrative which there's really not a Western European country that hasn't invoked it powerfully at some point in its history. The second thing I'll say is that I think that the regions of the West, if we can still call it that, where that chosen people narrative has left the deepest roots are ones that were strongly influenced by Reformed Protestantism. I mean, this is obvious in the case of England, North America, and for that matter, its other settler colonies, very strong in South Africa, very strong in Northern Ireland, very strong in certain ways in Australia as well. And there's been good work on that, which I'm sure many of you know. Now, there is also a kind of a second version, and this is, which I more associate with Eastern Europe, which is the idea of the nation as a crucified Christ. And so you find this, for example, very powerfully in Poland, but you also find it in the American South. I mean, that is really what Redeemer Nation, the South will rise again, means, the so-called lost cause mythology that was invented after the Confederate loss in the Civil War. I mean, it would be a great question to sort of push even deeper and think about whether or not there are not kind of well-nigh universal tropes or narratives that occur or recur in one form or another in the formations of peoples and nations throughout the world. But I mean, that's really beyond my scope. I mean, it would be a great book, but it would take half a lifetime to write if you did it properly, I think. Not trying to discourage anyone. I'm too old to take that on at this point, I think. And then the question about violence, right? So, so somebody mentioned in the chat, I forget whom, Slotkin's idea about regeneration through violence as being a kind of a central notion in the United States. And, you know, I personally see this as kind of a corollary of the end time story, which is indeed a story about regeneration through violence as kind of a recurring millenarian theme, which also has secular appropriation. So, you know, very famously, you know, Thomas Paine's, sentence, you know, we can always begin the world anew again. I'm probably not getting the quotation quite right, but this is also a very deep theme. But this idea of in white Christian individualism of righteous violence, right? That I think is really the key. That there are certain kinds of violence against certain kinds of targets for certain kinds of reasons, which are ipso facto forms of righteous violence. So police violence against Black thugs, against illegal aliens, even vigilante violence against those groups is widely regarded in the United States as righteous, and including by many Christians. I hate to say, in the United States.
Thank you so much for Phil. I think that's also a great way to come to a close. Well, where we are out of time, I think we really managed to cover an awful lot. And still, I feel in many ways we only scratched the surface. So really, thank you so much, both of you, for the fantastic contributions, and really to everybody for the fantastic questions and contributions here together in the discussion. Fortunately, both have just written, or like in the process of writing a book, or just written a book. So we are very much looking forward to diving in deeper with that, but also just a reminder, this is luckily only the start of a longer conversation with the other seminars to come. So I'm very much looking forward to continuing this conversation with all of you. But yes, a last round of applause to Jeff and Phil for, I think, really amazing contributions here. Thank you so much.